Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay, oh yay, oh yay.
Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome. No, this is not cabaret, it's Think About It, a podcast about the power of ideas and how language can change the world, with Uli Baer. What is the theory of language behind our understanding of free speech? Today I'm joined by Sonia, who is Associate Professor of Anthropology at New York University. As a specialist in linguistic anthropology, she wants to know how abstract ideas about speech are lived by human beings, and how language not only reflects the world we live in, but constructs it too. Is hate speech, for instance, just speech we dislike, or a phenomenon that impacts the way we live? She's an expert in linguistic anthropology and colonial linguistics, and the author of Linguistic Rivalries, Tamil Migrants and Anglo-Franco Conflicts, published by Oxford University Press. Today we have a special guest, an anthropologist, Sonia, who is Professor of Anthropology in New York University's Department of Anthropology. And I'm really happy you're here today, Sonia. Thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'd love to hear a little bit about your own work has been on sort of linguistic practices and the politics of language. Yes. And you're an anthropologist by training. And
right.
Maybe you can add a little bit, the speech debates are a big topic on campus.
Right.
And I wonder how you kind of think about them or approach them.
Well, thanks again for inviting me. I've been thinking about these issues of free speech probably since the beginning of the presidential cycle, the end of the last election. A lot of us in linguistic anthropology have been trying to articulate what would be the position of linguists and anthropologists on a topic that is obviously about language, and yet linguists have not featured prominently in this discussion. And so as linguistic anthropologists, we're really interested in the role of language as social action. So really free speech debates about whether speech is harmful or not, and in what context. It's all about what we do in linguistic anthropology, thinking about linguistic practices as not just reflecting the world, but actually constructing the world in which we live in. So
the difference would be for a linguistic anthropologist, you don't just look at this is a word, it means the following, but it actually creates a meaning.
Exactly.
And it gives people a way to think, this is important, this is not important, this is good, this is bad. So it's actually about the practice, you're saying, as how language operates in the world and can shape the world for many people.
Exactly, yeah. So, I think that it wouldn't be so much of a divide between, say, okay, there are linguists who think that language reflects the world, it describes the world, it asserts, versus we think language is shaping the world only. It's more nuanced than that, in the sense that as linguistic anthropology, we think of language, first of all, language as part of culture, right? So there's not this distinction in language and culture. So culture, cultural practices, language practices, but also that language, because of its structure, right? And a language is a highly structured system.
Right.
And so, that has evolved over time in different communities. It does, to a certain extent, reflect, or it draws our attention to what we think is reflected in the world, but also it draws our attention to the possibilities of how language can create new things that we assume is already reflected in the world.
Okay.
So it's this idea that it's called, to use very technical terms, that the way in which language is used in context presupposes certain things as already existing, but also entails new kinds of meanings that we assume exist, but they only exist because of some sort of ideological force.
And actually that's something lawyers would understand, because they actually deal with rulings which may not establish the truth, but actually have consequences in the world. So the legal language sort of has a real direct impact that's felt for people in one way. I think that's really easy for people to understand. Yeah. So is that one example of how language can actually have an impact on the context in which it is supposed to operate, rather than just it's a given, it means this or that?
Yeah, legal language would be, one of the more obvious examples. Even the fact that we have this thing called the First Amendment, right, which is very broad, very general, but it's been interpreted in different legal cases, and the way it's written will have impacts on future cases. So yeah, that's a really great example. But actually, most of us anthropologists were interested in everyday life.
Right.
So even in just like a conversation, right, the things that get implied and the sort of the implications, how those get built on and how they lead to new kinds of social action, new identities emerge, new values are shared or they're contested. So all that stuff that we take for granted as being fixed, like the normative aspects of society, we take a different view and we see sort of normativity as something that's both being reproduced and contested through everyday interactions.
Right.
So we're kind of focusing on more of the everyday, but of course the implication is at the level of sort of, because I'm interested in politics, we can think of legal language, we can think of political discourse.
And what was your work? So you wrote a book on kind of linguistic rivalries on Tamil migrants in Franco-Anglo. This is in a Canadian context, correct? So you've been interested in kind of charged language or language that has direct social implications before the election of President Trump, right? So this is your work before that in a book that Oxford published. So can you say a little bit about how your work was already focusing on this political aspect before?
Yes. In linguistic anthropology, my training has been focused on what we call language ideology, which is, very brief general definition. It's the kind of commonsensical ideas that people have about language and how those are related to, and the kinds of moral and political interests that are imbued or implied in the ways in which we think about language.
So ideology, not in a negative sense, just our assumptions about language.
Exactly.
So the ideas we have and the structures we think it operates under. Okay.
Exactly. But more politically, how those assumptions participate, what I was most interested in political processes. So my original research was on nationalism and what I thought was going to be discourses of multiculturalism in Canada and in Quebec specifically, and in the city of Montreal.
And how did you get interested in that?
Oh, well, that's more, I'm from Montreal. My mother's family is from there. They're French Canadian or Quebecois, and my father was an immigrant, an Indian immigrant to Montreal, so I was born there, and
so
I write about this in my book, actually.
So you had all those languages already in your world and in your both family and context and the country. Okay.
Yeah, and so it's interesting moving to the U.S. at a young age. People don't think about the politics of language on an everyday basis as they do in Quebec. I mean, it's kind of the bread and butter there. Everybody's thinking about language. Everything is political. So it's a great way to, so doing research in Quebec, it was easy for me to get people to talk about language as part of politics and the language politics. It was also very contentious, so there are some times when I asked questions that led to certain doors being shut, but that it was also really important research for me.
And you said in Quebec it's obvious to people almost because it's sort of a contested space, or people argue what language is the right one to use and what order, etc. But when then you come to the US, where you said people are maybe not as aware. I think we're very aware sort of with Spanish, right? And sort of immigrant communities sort of who are supposed to be brought into proper American English right away. So I think that's what people are aware of. But beyond that, I'm not sure there's a huge emphasis on language that's used.
And there's not the same kind of mobilization at the level of national identity. So in the US, you've got certain states in which there have been movements to promote language rights, particularly, sort of in the West Coast. Also, around this area, the Northeast. My research was on heritage language, which is a concept that, may not be used everywhere, but this idea that as an immigrant, first or second or third generation, so as a minority, if you are part of a minority language community or family, the idea is that you have the right to be educated or to learn that language, not just in spoken language, but also the written language. So the Canadian government funds this.
So that the public institutions, the government, should recognize that people have other languages they bring to this nation, and they have a right to be educated or live in this language. And not, you can speak a language at home, but at school and everywhere else you're going to use English. So.
Right. So in Quebec, the idea it's a little bit more complicated, and I don't want to make it sound like this is a value that's been not contested itself in the Canadian space. A lot of it was very specific. This program, heritage language programs, emerged in the 1970s when there was a mobilization against when the sort of the French nationalists came to power in Quebec, right? So they took over the provincial government, and so it was a concession. It was very literally called a concession to minority voters to get them to come aboard the French nationalist the Quebecois Nationalist Project,
Okay.
Which ultimately got decided in referendums and, sort of never came to
Right.
fruition.
Right.
But it was about, so now you can petition if you have enough parents that say we want our school to teach Arabic, or we want our school to teach Tamil or Hindi after school or during lunch. The resources are there, then the public
Right.
school system will offer those classes.
Unlikely that this will happen here, I think. In New York City,
Yeah.
where we have probably up to 200 languages spoken actively by
Yeah.
students in the entire school system. So
Yeah.
this would be a great place. But people will say immediately, we don't have the resources, we can't do that. And secondly, they'll say, but then the kids won't learn proper English if they have Tamil or if they have, Bangla, or they speak something in the afternoons. Shouldn't they be brought into this mainstream to speak like Americans?
Yeah. So the English-only movement in the U.S. operates around this kind of moral panic about what's going to happen in English. The quality of English will deteriorate if we let in these other languages. So not just the children won't learn English, but that the state of English will be threatened, most specifically by Spanish, right?
Okay.
And so that's sort of at the national level of the discourse. But then you could see, for example, in New York City, where Bengali, which is my mother tongue actually also, is one of the largest one of the languages spoken by the largest number of people in New York City. You can have translators providing services for parents and children in Bengali, but teaching them Bengali in a school is seen as, well, first of all, no one's thinking about Bengali, but you can imagine a situation in which, say, the South Asian population
Right.
was being vilified in a certain way, then it would become, a political issue.
Yeah.
So these questions about race are actually very central.
But that's interesting how it intersects. The
Yeah.
political thinker Hannah Arendt once said in a very problematic essay,
Yeah.
but nonetheless an interesting thing, in the second generation, the accents disappear,
Yeah.
but visible markers of difference, namely racial difference, don't disappear.
Right.
She said there's visibility, which is different from audibility. I still have an accent. My children who are bilingual don't have an accent in
Right.
English anymore.
Right.
So in some way, she said, with generations, successive generations, they become Americanized in this normative way.
Yeah.
You think there's a moral panic that this English will be bad English, that the future
Yeah.
of the world will speak bad English. So let's put that aside.
Okay.
But what you just said, that racial identity is
Yes.
sort of connected to this in a way?
Yes. So my research in Canada was post 9/11, right? It was also one of the things that we don't know in the US, but the migration of Tamil speakers from Sri Lanka in the aftermath and during the Civil War there was much more pronounced in Canada. The US was pretty much limiting that migration. So Canada is much more generous at refugee policy. After 9/11, discourses about terrorism and terrorists crossing the border into the US led to a response among the Canadian government trying to sort of, identify terrorist groups within Canada as they're working in conjunction with the US.
Okay.
Also, you've got so during this context, as Sri Lankans Tamils were migrating to Canada in large number. I mean, there's probably more than 200,000 in Canada, in Toronto alone. And then I was also interested in Indian Tamils, and there are very different social classes, and so there was a divide. Even though they speak the same language, there was a kind of internal divide. But what was interesting is that this idea of in French, le Tamil, which means the Tamil, as a racial slur started to emerge. And it means terrorist, and it's used interchangeably regardless of your phenotype.
So you're saying there's a new context, new political context.
Yeah.
Because of what happens in the US, Canada is also swept under this kind of anti-terrorism fever.
Yeah.
And now people who are otherwise very distinct, very different, are swept into one category, which becomes a category for terrorists.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And it's used interchangeably with, sort of racial slurs targeting Arab people believed to be of Arab descent, which is really not always the case.
Okay.
So, and people believed to be Muslim, and sort of this category, which doesn't make sense to Americans, really, this idea that the Tamil would be seen as a racial slur. But it is become so nonetheless.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so that has led to, I was interested in how this idea of the Tamil as a racial slur was leading to the ways in which Indians and Sri Lankans were differentiating their language, and trying to say, well, we speak different languages. And so that was the context of that research. But the question about race and identity, I think, is really interesting, because if you go back to how anthropologists or linguistic anthropologists think about language in society, again, we don't think just every racial group has its own, or every ethnic group has its own language and that's their identity, right? But that there's more of a dialectic relationship. So when the national discourse or the regional discourse about race shifts, people themselves are going to use language in different ways.
Okay, and you mean dialectical then, just to break this down a little bit?
Yeah.
So kind of mutually interdependent. So there's one
Yeah.
process on one side.
Yeah.
The terms start to mean something and then people respond to it also.
Right, and the language itself can change
And the
too.
language changes.
And that the language structure itself is also limiting the kinds of responses that people are making. So it's kind of this back and forth, and there's theories, I mean, sort of we can trace back to early 20th century, mid 20th century ideas about, and even earlier ideas about how the structure of a language will influence or predispose us to think about the world in certain ways.
That's interesting.
And I don't want to go, we're definitely not promoting any kind of deterministic view, but there's definitely an influence.
An influence. So
Yes.
let's do, the only things I know here, I'm very uninformed, is sort of Wittgenstein language games and Chomsky. Sort of this is this a determinant? Would that be more closer to a deterministic idea that?
Well, I would separate the two.
Yes.
I would sort of put Chomsky in the category of a more like kind of a referential or Caesarean view that language is just a reflection, sort of that actually language in society is irrelevant, right? That we need to just study language as a system, whether it's grammatical or cognitive, whereas Wittgenstein was more interested in language as interaction, right? So that would fall
as
more
a game,
under
rules,
but sort of that's kind of following under this. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I think Wittgenstein's ideas about language is, the rules of language as a game would fall under more of a pragmatic view of language. And this is really directly relevant to how I'm thinking about the First Amendment, because, so I'm still very much in the beginning of my research on issues of free speech in sort of the American context. But one of the things that struck me in talking to legal scholars and actually looking at some of the literature is that there's a very particular theory of language that's being enshrined in whether it's not so much in the Constitution, but the legal interpretation of free speech. And so I think this is really the area of research that has not been fully explored. Like, what is our theory of language that we're operating on in our legal system?
That's actually really fascinating, because I've read a fair amount, not nearly enough, but a fair amount of kind of jurisprudence and legal interpretations and justifications for applying one or another free speech principle. Almost none of them talk about what they assume language is or how it works in the world. They just assume it's self-evident. Language is what we speak and it means things and people understand it. It's so simplistic, it's not even how language works in an everyday interaction where I can misunderstand you. That's almost not really permitted to be, or not necessary for them to operate.
Exactly. So from what I understand about sort of legal jurisprudence and the interpretations of free speech and then also hate speech, well, first of all, I think that there's very few cases in which we can label something as hate speech that's been prosecuted, right? And so really, most of the legal scholars tell me that hate speech is more kind of like an ideological construct than something really legally, something that exists legally.
In the law currently, let's say, hate speech, people hesitate to give it a clear definition. They say, okay, if it is attached to certain things, which so obscenity, as you said in sort of the work you've already done, sort of obscenity, incitement, direct incitement, that a reasonable person would understand as such.
Okay, right. So I really honed in on two things that I saw in these cases, which is this idea of a reasonable person, and also the idea of intent. And so I had this written down. So my understanding of the legal cases in the U.S., it's this idea that what would a reasonable person interpret as the intent to cause harm? And that would be the basis for perhaps sort of limiting free speech rights, right? And sort of whether or not it's called hate speech.
That's right. So they're assuming there's a speaker and there's someone who hears the speech, and then there's this external kind of sort of clear-minded, neutral, benevolent legal witness who says, I'm reasonable, and I hear it as such. And I either hear it as direct incitement, fighting words or something, or I hear it as a kind of obscenity that's so gratuitous and has no other merit. But they're assuming there's this person who's kind of, could you explain to me, who would that person be who could look at language as an interaction and be reasonable and be sort of removed from it?
So this is where the anthropology becomes really useful in thinking cross-culturally, right? And so before I answer that, so who would be a reasonable person? I actually have no idea, legally speaking, how that's being imagined, because my sense is that the kind of dialogical view of language as interaction, that one of the aspects of the dialogical view of language is that language is interaction, right? That it involves, you know, more than one person, or just a speaker, a listener, multiple parties, and that everybody's kind of co-constructing the meaning, right? That would be one view of the dialogical view of language. I suspect that that's very far from the ways in which the kind of philosophical underpinnings of our legal system, in the ways in which they think about language as something other than merely a transparent description of the world.
Right.
So already they're kind of out of their field.
Although I would say, of course, correct, with the huge caveat that we have this incredibly exciting jurisprudence for 200 years where people dispute every single interpretation of every single word in the law. So in some way the law, on the one hand, assumes it's reasonable, we'll understand, and then every contract put in front of a judge or jury is debated, disputed, so the law also has this enormous capacity to see things in different ways. But at this moment, it's just saying there's a reasonable understanding, let's not open this up to...
Right. But I mean, there's a certain model of authority. Who's the authority in this act of interpretation, right? And it's not the listener, really. It's not. It's the sort of the judge, the jury, the lawyers,
and that's really
the
important.
educated elite.
Right. So in the context that you brought up of hate speech, there's a speaker and then there's presumably a listener. Mm-hmm. And the claim is that this is injurious, harmful to the quality or dignity or standing of this person who's being addressed in this way.
Right.
But then there's this reasonable person outside who is not feeling this impact, but just adjudicates what is the impact.
Yes. So it's not a model of the listener. It's still very much a speaker-focused model of language in which there are these external evaluators that were never part of the original interaction. So going back to this idea of hate speech, I mean, thinking anthropologically, so there's the idea of the reasonable person that one could sort of take apart and deconstruct. And then I was also very much interested in this idea of intent, right?
Could I just stay on the reasonable person for a moment? So when you said you said something earlier, if I get this right, sort of cross-cultural competence. As an anthropologist, is there a role for someone like a reasonable person who is sort of looking at an interaction? Because in a kind of old, sort of early 20th century idea of anthropologists, isn't it what anthropologists did for a while? They would go somewhere, observe some social interaction, and then write about it? So can you say a little bit more how anthropology with a cross-cultural understanding breaks that down, this illusion of the neutral, objective bystander?
Oh wow, that's a good.
You know what I mean? Like, couldn't the anthropologist be the one? Couldn't I just get you as an expert witness and say you are the linguistic anthropologist? You can explain to me whether this hate speech is really hate speech.
But then you're still operating within a category of the expert, right?
Yes.
And so anthropology, in sort of the reflexive turn of anthropology, you could say that anthropology is known as engaging in practices of participant observation. Right? We participate in a community's everyday life. And then we've got sort of one foot in the community and one foot out of the community, and that gives us a kind of sort of objective stance to be able to make the exotic familiar and the familiar exotic, right? And that's sort of been the hallmark of anthropological expertise. So one can say, let's take an anthropologist and make them the adjudicator, and that would just be swapping one model of expertise for another. I guess what I would say is that going back to this idea of the theory of language, right, and how it's not a very dialogical theory of language, still very speaker-focused. If one were thinking cross-culturally in sort of anthropological studies of communication and language use, you know, sort of around the world, one of the things that we've discovered is that the ways in which responsibility and reasonableness, or the way in which we attribute responsibility for the effects of language, how language has a kind of effect in the world, right? Which is basically, you know, a more pragmatic view of language. You could look at different communities and see how their own theories of language embrace the notion that language, its meaning doesn't emerge from the speaker or an external expert, but is being produced through that interaction itself.
And can you give an example, sort of, when we're looking at hate speech, before we go to intent, sort of you're saying, so speech, the impact of speech is produced as much by the way language operates in a community as by the speaker, him or herself. So I want to say something, I want to have this intent. I can't entirely control that because there's a pattern or context or history to these words that give it some kind of meaning that is not mine entirely.
Right, exactly.
So we're not going to a kind of postmodernist, there's no meaning at all, intent at all. There is intent, but it will be influenced or shaped or sometimes derailed or amplified by the context in which this community thinks language operates.
So I guess there's two ways to approach this. You could think about it cross-culturally and look at communities in which they either don't recognize intent as meaningful, or they think that intent might be meaningful, but it's unknowable, and therefore it's irrelevant in determining the outcome of an interaction.
Okay.
And there's been research, particularly in the Pacific, that's sort of documented this.
Interesting, yeah.
So you can think about, well, in these particular communities, how are they attributing responsibility and blame for the effects of language or communication? And they would do so by thinking about, sort of regardless of the speaker's intent,
right.
What was the effect?
Right.
And so I guess going back to the U.S. case, or sort of other cases in which there's this notion of intent that's enshrined in the law, we have to ask ourselves, instead of saying, well, intent doesn't matter. Well, it does matter because of our legal system,
right.
And the kinds of ideologies that we have, right. About language.
Right.
It is a social fact. And
right.
so another thing that I'm interested in doing is thinking more historically and sort of thinking about how, and this is still sort of a work in progress, but why is it that intention has become the basis upon which we're attributing, or it's sort of the most limited way in which we can possibly conceive of language as having a social sort of impact in the world, right?
Because it's not, as you think, it's not just as a linguistic anthropologist, but as a person in the world.
Yes.
We know that it's not just the intent of what somebody says
that
determines how we understand or how we respond to something.
Yeah.
Even if someone tells you in a sarcastic way, I wouldn't step on that, the intent may be to want you to step on it, and you're like, I'm not going to step on this, it's a snake or something like that.
Yeah.
It's like, irony, for example, undermines the whole idea of intent. Someone tells you something and you're smart enough to say, he means the opposite.
Exactly.
No, he wants to trick me or something. So intent is shaped by how we hear it.
Yeah.
So it's not just anthropologists. So if you go a little further with this, so you sort of you want to see, is there a reason why we privileged intent so much?
Yes. So I think what you're saying is that when we in everyday life conversation, we know that intent doesn't mean everything, and we don't act accordingly, right? And we play with language in many creative ways, and that's what we do. But yet then we've got these institutions that are promoting a particular view of language. So this is why it goes back to questions about reflexivity. To what extent what can we access? How are we accessing what language is doing in our everyday life? To what extent can we really think about what we're doing with language? And we're sort of predisposed, not just through the grammar of our language, but also through these larger discourses about language, our legal institutions, how we go to school and we think about, what are valued languages and what are not valued languages. So as we live our lives in society, we're constantly being inculcated or, socialized into certain limited ways of thinking about language, which are more or less in line with these larger institutional forces, of which one is the legal system.
Okay.
So what I'm interested in doing is partly thinking about the history behind why intent has become so significant. And a lot of people have written about this, in philosophy and anthropology, so I'm not contributing anything new, but I think that, another problem that we should add to this question of hate speech and free speech is the notion speech, right? So if you actually think about it, from what I understand, the law is not really only about speech, like verbal language, but it could be symbols,
of
right?
Course.
And so why are we using this term speech, really? And then in a sense, so it's constructing a particular divide between the sort of orality and literacy, right? The spoken and the written. And then once you start thinking about that, then you can start tapping into all those kinds of ideologies that, since the 16th century, 16th, 17th century in early modern Europe and sort of through the Enlightenment into, present day, how we attribute certain kinds of notions to speech versus written language. This idea that speech is relatively harmless has a particular history, right? In which the written language was seen as the more consequential language. And that was something that, sort of definitely by the 18th century, by the time we wrote our Constitution, was kind of very firmly established. And that's when we see the emergence of copyright, and we still see practices of censorship, right? So this idea of that written language is something more consequential, something more fixed. Therefore, spoken language and those spoken cultures are sort of less harmful, right?
To add something to this, in the American context, I also think the way the First Amendment is celebrated, it's usually it's the individual's right to contest the language of the government.
Yes.
Or the actions of the government.
Yeah.
And the government, as you're saying, they are enshrined in written documents.
Yes.
Their laws or their statutes or their constitutions. And in some ways there's this weird way of fearing that there's an imbalance between these kind of biblical like written texts and then this one individual speaking out.
Yes.
So,
that's great.
So free speech is kind of protected as my individual expression versus this overwhelming institutional power.
Yes.
Because the First Amendment really regulates that the government cannot tell you to shut up.
Exactly.
It doesn't say much else actually. It actually really says only acts of Congress, so it really is very specific.
Yeah.
Speech has been opened up, which is kind of interesting. I think your work is kind of helped by the fact that now campaign finance contributions are speech. That burning certain things, crosses, flags are speech. So speech is really broad by First Amendment theorists. But they don't really start at the first place where you're starting to say, what even is speech? You just expand the concept in a way that dilutes it maybe to a point where you can say, well, you haven't even figured out the first part. What is speech really in society?
Which is why I think that I've been trying to think about sort of the campus debates, right? And how to put this in because one of the questions you had told me that you were interested in was about what's unique about this particular moment and what's going on in the college campuses. I think that labeling these issues as issues of free speech and hate speech, which is what I myself did in that workshop, is some ways a distraction or misleading us from sort of the larger issues of what's going on and sort of making us think of this as a singular moment, right? Very unique or very specific to right here and now. But I think what I'm seeing when we think about sort of how the legal interpretation of free speech is moving beyond actual verbal acts of criticizing the government, right? To things about infringing on copyright, slander, all these kinds of things are sort of being enfolded or being imagined as possibly being enfolded. I think that it falls under broader rubrics. I was trying to think about it as sort of a rubric of censorship, and how do we think about sort of what's going on in college campuses as tapping into larger debates about the censorship of ideas.
Okay.
And that's kind of what I'm finding to be more productive, because once we start thinking about free speech or hate speech, then of course someone will ask you, well, define hate speech, right? And then of course, legally there's nothing actually, there's hate crimes, but there's no hate speech.
There's currently no definition, and secondly, people will say, but free speech doesn't need a definition because it's self-evident. Because we all know what it means. So in some funny way, they're saying free speech is anybody can say anything whenever, except, as you just pointed out, except the law is always recognized in this country, and everybody, every human being actually recognizes there are rules in human interactions. If I kept on interrupting you the entire time, it's not going to have the effect that we want to have a conversation. So in some ways there are rules we accept. Hate speech, I think what's interesting what you're saying, there are larger questions, and there may be more about how does a university function, what are the rules we accept when we come in. And one of the default assumptions is, the rules should be anybody can say anything, which I don't believe is really true. And a couple other guests on the podcast have said that is not how universities operate.
Of course not.
I'm actually talking to you because you're an expert and you're a trained anthropologist and you've done enormous amount of research. I just don't invite anybody off the street because it could be helpful, it could be free speech, but it doesn't really add anything to my goals, which is to understand things.
Yeah, so this question about the campuses, well, first of all, I think we need to distinguish again between private universities and public universities, in which the laws are different. But at NYU, which is a private university, free speech laws don't really apply because it's not about criticizing, the government really, right? And so it becomes a broader question, I think, about pedagogy. It becomes a question about the values of the university. And it becomes a question about, I think, questions about expertise and authority. And I think that we're in a moment, this is where I'm kind of still trying to struggle to come to terms with what's happening. I taught a class last semester or 2 semesters ago called Language, Power, and Identity. And this was the first time I actually had my students discuss free speech issues. And there was a moment in the class where 2 students were actually, one student said, well, I don't think the government should limit how I speak about transgender people. And he was referring to a new law in Canada that had been passed. He's a Canadian. And another student was very offended because she found that offensive that this other student was not recognizing, the rights of a transgender person to be called by the preferred pronoun and other issues like that, and acknowledging the history of prejudice and discrimination. it was a really eye-opening moment for me as a teacher, not really in that moment knowing how to handle these questions of whether we call it censorship or not. Should I censor their students' views so that, that the class will function properly? Should I censor one of the students? So one of my students asked me, I don't think you should call on the students so much, the one who was, and so I think these are all really important pedagogical questions, actually, and also in which, as university teachers, we don't actually know all the answers for.
Right.
And the other thing is, I think that students have a lot to teach us about this particular moment in time.
But to go back to this for a moment,
sure.
Your hesitation would be, in some ways, as a teacher, you wouldn't want to censor, and
No.
you wouldn't want to say you can't say that, because you think usually you try as a teacher to say this has some pedagogical merit. Even if the question is maybe not phrased quite the way one would want, you say, okay, we can talk about this.
Yes.
If the other student says, I find this, and I'm interested in this, when they say I'm offended, a lot of people say, well, your feelings, you can sort of check them at the door.
Mm-hmm.
But what you said earlier, language operates not in a vacuum. In some ways, you cannot check your feelings at the door. You cannot check your politics at the door. Actually, one of the famous Supreme Court cases allowed students to have political expression in school and say, you don't leave your politics at the door.
Right, yes.
But so this student is bringing her politics into the classroom.
Yes.
And I think this is right. There's a question here, how do you navigate that? Because you're supposed to create the space where anything goes, except it's supposed to have a purpose. And if one student leaves the room feeling this is not allowing me to participate anymore, then that's not working.
Exactly. And so, I mean, just to make a long story short, I met with each of the students and tried to sort of see what their point of view was, and I wrote an email. I sort of wrote out my interpretation of free speech and why I thought, and sort of made it an open-ended question. I mean, my class was about language and power and identity, so I was inviting this. I was just not fully prepared for what would happen, which is part of sort of this kind of thing about language. You can't really anticipate what's going to happen, and sort of questions about responsibility. I think this is really what is at the heart of these debates. It's about how do we attribute responsibility for the effects of language, right? And the effects of language as a cultural practice in which we are part of a community, even if these communities might be more or less ephemeral, in which we have relations with one another.
Right.
And so I think these are great questions to be pursuing in a class. And so if I teach the class again, I will be more aware and sort of make it part of the discussion, So I personally don't.
But also what you're saying, what I hear you saying, it was a challenging thing.
Yeah.
It was what we call a teachable moment or an opportunity. It could be resolved from a position that you have in the classroom of some power and some kind of authority.
Right.
But it wasn't a crisis and a total breakdown. And I think what I've seen a little too much in the media is this characterization, which is a caricature of the universities. That, these overly sensitive students shutting down debate. And you're saying, a student said, is this really pedagogically useful, helping us? And why do we keep on coming up with this question in some ways, whether it's the one student speaking a lot or saying, okay, is this really worth debating in a certain way, or is it actually countering what we're trying to do?
Well, I even think I would take it a step further. I think the student that was offended about how the other students said that he didn't want there to be free speech limitations on his use of pronouns, right? That was the
Yes.
She really educated me about the ways in which I'm even responding to the conversation in class and sort of, so I felt it was a teachable moment, right, for me, and it also sort of helped me to think about what's at stake for these students and how they're willing to take my class and willing to talk about things that they wouldn't be willing to talk about in other classes. And so that's a kind of sort of, it's almost a social contract between us. Like, we're willing to tell you things about ourselves and explore our experiences and relate it to the academic literature, but we expect you as a teacher to be willing to understand where you are making a mistake. So I think there's a kind of humility that I learned, or that was expressed, and sort of, as teachers, we are authorities. We know the literature, we sort of set the syllabus, and these are all practices of censorship, right? I'm writing the syllabus, this is what I want you to study, but yet I think this particular moment of time, students are not exactly right now, and I don't really know this, sort of I'm not a scholar of the higher education, but it seems that students are feeling more empowered ideally they would feel more empowered to give input and help us.
I think there's two parts to it. I think we are witnessing a generation that has adopted something which I think is quite powerful and saying, this is my truth.
Yeah,
and I think this is a position that is on every side of the political spectrum. I think it's a fantasy to think only sort of social justice warriors and transgender activists are saying this is my truth. I think you have the alt-right saying this is my truth.
Yes.
And you have everybody on every political, imaginable space saying this is my truth, and it counts for so much. So I think the elevation of experience is powerful thing, because suddenly for the first time we're listening to people who we haven't listened to as an institution forever.
Yeah.
I always tell my colleagues, they used to refer to their, the female students as girls, let the girls sit over here or something like that, or their female colleagues as girls. Yes. I said, that has changed. Linguistic behavior, today unacceptable.
Right.
So I said, so if you have to use a different pronoun now, maybe you could learn how social reality moves on. There's progress.
Exactly.
The challenge is what you said much earlier. You said you started becoming interested after the election of President Trump, because we have a climate now where lots of kind of checks have been removed, where there's a language possible in political space that really wasn't acceptable from positions and from people in positions of authority.
But to be perfectly honest, I think I became interested because other people were interested in sort of this idea of censorship after the election of Trump.
Yes,
But I was interested because I was coming up for tenure review, and this idea of academic freedom also is tied into, so it's not by accident that I'm doing this research now that I've already gone through my tenure review.
So can you say something about this, sort of like because it touches on what you as an academic can express or be interested in? Yes,
and I think that's, so to go back to the workshop, we had two speakers. So David Cole was talking about, so this is what's going on college campuses, but he's the National Legal Director of the ACLU.
Yes.
And he was talking about, the experience on college campuses, but he asked us to think about also, well, what about outside the university where it's a less of a protected space, and sort of what happens here might become a model for what happens outside of this institution, how we need to think about outside the academic silo. And so that was one point. Another point, we had a journalist who came in and who was talking about sort of attacks on the freedom of the press. And so what I'm sort of interested in doing now is thinking cross-institutionally. So there's, freedom of the press, there's ideas about academic freedom, how we're thinking about free speech in terms of, what student groups can say, who they can invite, what's happening in the classroom. And then also I'm starting a new research project on policing, and I've actually gotten some, hopefully this will come through in a few days, funding, in which I'm going to be looking at interactions between police officers and subjects in the context of DUI cases, driving under the influence in South Carolina, to look at these issues of both excessive use of police force and sort of police violence, sort of this contentious issue about what's going on in these really highly charged interactions, right? And so one of my insights is that basically my, hypothesis is that not everyone enjoys the same freedom of speech rights as everybody else in this country, right? And sort of this makes sense. We can think about how racially, in terms of gender, and sort of different minority groups are not enjoying the same free speech rights because of extra legal ways in which our language is being policed. And so this is something I'm interested in exploring and how it's playing out in interactions with police and subjects.
So you're looking specifically about direct interactions between subjects, people who have been stopped and then the police are asking them questions, and you're saying about the use of language in this context.
In both cases, right? So looking at the escalation of conflict, in which technically a police officer is, sort of, a representative of the government, and therefore free speech rights should be in play. You should have the right to criticize a police officer, and yet we know that there are ways in which that is being limited, but also we understand that the police themselves feel under threat, and sort of are trying to mitigate the escalation of conflict. So it's a really kind of complex issue.
That's really interesting. I actually have a high school friend who was a police officer who was doing a very kind of difficult demonstration. The police officers were giving instructions to the people where to move, where they couldn't move. And he said, this is useful to a point, but as soon as it crosses a line, citizens are not deputized and they're not soldiers or something like that. The police
Right.
can give us instructions, but only to a point, if it's about our own safety, but the police cannot order us around. We're actually citizens, we're free.
Right.
And it was really interesting to me because I thought, well, the police officer tells you to move, you move.
Yeah.
But you can say, no, there's no reason for me to move, I can stand here.
Right.
So in some ways what you're saying is where the free speech comes in, and people who are in different positions may not speak up because they fear the repercussions, or they're being heard or listened to in different ways.
Yeah, and I actually have access to video recordings of the video and body cam data, so I have seen that happening, in which people say, well, I'm not going to respond because I'm a black man and I know the law, implying that. But also you can see in which there are, and this is something I'm still not sure yet, I still haven't looked through the data, but one can assume that extra sort of other charges might be, taken against the suspect for escalating conflict verbally, for example, breach of peace, disorderly conduct, things like that.
Right.
So there's a lot, but what's more interesting to me in terms of this larger question about free speech, because a lot of people don't really necessarily see the connection between free speech and policing, is that right now I'm trying to understand what is the theory of language in policing interactions, where the police officer and the suspect, they're so sensitive to this interaction, right? It's not just about I'm protesting the government, right, and making a speech. It's actually what's happening interactionally and what's going to be the outcome.
Between the two people, let's say, at that moment.
Yeah, in that particular moment. And so I'm interested in the training of officers, how they're being trained in terms of thinking about language, in terms of escalation of conflict, and sort of what are the assumptions of the subjects in terms of how we think about the effects of language,
Right.
So I think that there are different institutions. So coming back to your original question about these different domains, I think, these different institutional domains in which we're seeing us talk about speech rights in a particular way. What are the commonalities and what are their differences? And I think what's so interesting for me in thinking about the campus situation and comparing it to the policing situation is that in some ways they're very different, right? And so here we see students trying to participate in a practice of censorship that has traditionally been the domain of professors or administrators. We set the agenda, the students learn from us, right? And they're trying to sort of participate in the sort of collective educational experience. Whereas now we're seeing in other domains where the ability to even sort of shape an interaction is being limited because it's a high conflict kind of situation. And I don't see those as, so I think that
you don't see them as analogous because one is a high conflict, or you do see them as...
I don't see them as analogous in the sense I think that if one were to, I think that I think that the category of free speech could be legally evoked in both situations, but yet we're dealing with very different kinds of understandings of speech, of what's free and rights, and with completely different populations. So I'm wondering why we're talking about free speech right now. And I think I think that, I don't know.
So you're saying because of this sort of greater public attention and awareness of sort of, for example, police or injustices committed by the police, which is largely thanks to social movements like Black Lives Matter and social media, because people can now have body cams and see it as evidence, and it's harder to avoid acknowledging it because you can see it. It used to be only some communities knew about it. So you're saying that may inform why the free speech issue kind of migrates into all these other spaces, and this is a free speech violation.
It may not actually, and that becomes an interesting question. And I think it's also sort of there's Black Lives Matter and there's Blue Lives Matter, and sort of this contentiousness about how sort of who's to blame, right? And sort of I think it's coming back to these issues about not so much free speech, because you don't really hear people saying so much this is a free speech issue in the policing context, but legally it could be construed as such, right? But you see a greater attention to language, and also what you're talking about, social media and evidence. It's about evidence. It's about, again, how we're tracing the evidence of the effects of language and sort of it being captured on, cell phones and dash cams and video cams, and sort of to what extent now is this leading to a reformulation of how we're thinking about language in a way that might be different. It may not be, and sort of it's a moving target, and so that's also really interesting.
It opens up. I mean, it's really great. You're kind of opening up this category of speech in a much deeper way, and in some ways, it has not maybe been so helpful for it to be just applied as if, first of all, the law knows what it is and has taken sort of done the work to explain it. It just actually has to have a very kind of simple communicative idea of speech, although then it deviates from that all the time.
Yeah.
And to open it up in different contexts.
Yeah.
So it raises really useful questions, I think, how to think about the campus controversies in relation to other things happening in society.
Right. Some of the proponents within philosophy of thinking about hate speech as something that should be seen as a social fact, right, have looked towards this linguistic theory called speech act theory.
Yes.
And so in order to show that actually language has effects in the world, right?
Which is like the greatest example is sort of this meeting is closed now, class is over, then class is over by simply me stating it.
Right, so the utterance has some sort of performative effect, this idea of the performative utterance. But what's problematic about, in the philosophy of language, what's problematic about them working within this theory itself is its kind of Western-centric assumptions in that language again, which goes back to ideas about intention. So speech act theory, as it was articulated in the mid-20th century, went down this pathway of saying that the sort of the performative effect of language depends on the intention of the speaker.
And the authority or power or presumed authority. And using there's other cultures or cultural contexts in which it may actually, intent may not be the determining factor.
Right, so there's that. So sort of we can think, if we thought more sort of broader culturally, not everyone thinks about intent as being relevant. But then also, if we were to construct a theory of language in which we think about language as performative, one wouldn't necessarily privilege intention, really, in terms of thinking about, again, going back to the way I was talking about sort of how language is part of the process in which we're reproducing society, but also sort of recreating it itself. So I feel that, unfortunately, a lot of the people that are doing work, whether it's in critical race theory or sort of various forms of, whether it's feminist jurisprudence or sort of trying to bring up this idea that hate speech is a real thing, right? They're still kind of working within these presuppositions about intent, right? And that one could actually, so if we were to sort of take intent out of the picture and think about language as just basically a form of social action and sort of think about the ways in which we attribute responsibility and sort of open that up and sort of legally open that up and think about, okay, so and it's not just a question of, okay, well, if I say something harmful and that hurts your feelings, should I be held responsible or not? Because then, again, that's limiting, sort of the idea to language as being sort of the meaning of language is only being produced within the interaction itself. But there's a whole history of, like you mentioned before, language itself is not simply located in the here and now, but is being formed.
Certain words carry an entire history.
Exactly.
Even if I don't mean to invoke it, I just did.
Exactly.
And so what you said much earlier about the idea of Tamil in Canada, which has changed its meaning, as in, if I'm not familiar with Quebec, I wouldn't even know any of that, so I may actually use the term in some ways and suddenly carrying a history or resonance that I'm not aware of. So that's what you're looking at, how that changes.
Exactly.
I think I'll have you back at some point to talk about speech act theory and feminist jurisprudence and critical race theory. So, Sonia, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. Well, I hope we'll get to talk again.
And this is great. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you.